Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new or returning to the channel, it's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this week's episode I'll be making a bowl from English walnut 3-colour epoxy resin with a black walnut segmented rim. So without further ado, let's get into it. After I cut 30mm off the section of walnut to reduce the overall height of the finished piece, I marked the centre point and drilled a hole to position it on the circle cutting jig. The jig is a piece of 1/2-inch plywood with a hole drilled for the metal locating pin. I use it on the bandsaw to cut circular blanks to fit in the casting bucket. I do a series of straight cuts, gradually getting it down to a rough circle. After cutting the blank, it was time for casting. I mixed 3 batches of my usual brand of resin. The chosen colours were gold, carmine rose and black mica powder with a splash of black alcohol dye. Each one was thoroughly mixed, then left to pre-cure. Pre-curing the resin helps with colour separation. During the curing process, the resin heats up. This causes convection, which basically mixes everything together. So if I was just to pour them into the casting straight after mixing, I could end up with a muddy mess. The resin heated up very quickly, so I added it to the casting bucket. The trick here is to pour it just before it begins to gel. This will also stop large amounts of resin being absorbed into the timber blank. I added weight to stop the timber floating and put the whole thing in the pressure pot. Added the usual 50 to 55 psi and left it overnight to cure. Next was the segmented rim. I made this from a piece of black walnut. I needed to cut 2 strips at around 50mm wide. I used the bandsaw to cut a straightish edge, then I passed this over the jointer. Then I returned to the bandsaw to cut the lengths that I needed. Then it was over to the table saw to cut the segments. I needed 18, each one cut with a 10-degree angle. For this I use a prefixed miter sled, and whilst this gets me reasonable quality segments, coming up in a future video to make more accurate segmented rings, I'll be making a wedgie stroke miter sled based on the Jerry Bennett design, modified to fit this Bosch saw. It'll also have a saw stop to go with it. With all the segments cut, each one was sanded, then I assembled the ring. Using a large 3D printed template, I arranged them in a circle and used an elastic band to hold them in place while I superglued mixing sticks over the top. I didn't want to use a 3D printed joint spacer template because that would leave plastic tabs embedded in the joints of the finished piece. And so with one side done, I pressed it out of the template and glued on more mixing sticks to hold everything nice and firm. That done, it was ready for casting. This segmented ring will form the rim, and I thought about which colour would be best for the resin joints. I was leaning towards gold, but in the end I settled on black. I used a 10-inch silicone baking tray for the mould, with another mould to fill the centre, with a 6-inch blank sat in it to stop it collapsing. I mixed a full batch of resin coloured with black alcohol dye and a smidge of black mica powder, and with there only being one colour, I added it straight to the mould, which, to avoid any spills trying to squeeze it in after it was full, I'd already placed in the pressure pot liner. With weights added, it went into the pressure pot, swapping places with the main blank. I added the usual pressure and left it overnight to cure. It's the next day, and off camera, I'd freed the casting from the bucket, and initially things didn't look so good. I couldn't see any cracks, but there were so many voids. I considered using a Dremel to cut channels from the voids up to the top, then putting it back in the bucket and adding more resin to fill in the holes. Whilst I had a think, I chiselled away the excess waste block, and while doing this I decided to use the blank as it was. The thing that swayed me was that most of the voids would be turned away, getting down to the surface of the wood. So I marked the centre, drilled a couple of holes and fixed it to the lathe using the woodworm screw. Because of the voids and the cut of the walnut, the blank wasn't very well balanced, so I could only get the speed up to around 800 RPM, but that was enough to get started. Using the full-size carbide, I set about removing the outer layers of resin, but as with my last project, the woodworm screw wasn't holding. Retightening the tailstock helped, so I removed just enough to get the workpiece balanced. The main purpose here was to get the mortise cut, so I could turn it around and level the top. As you can see, the voids look quite bad, but there's still a way to go to expose the walnut, so with the blank better balanced, I was happy to move on to cutting the mortise. I got a bit ahead of myself cutting the recess first, so I had to go back and level the underside, but thankfully there wasn't a lot to take off. That done, I cut away the inner material with a bowl gouge, cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter, then went back to remove the last little bit in the centre. As I cut in, I wasn't really thinking about the loose woodworm screw, but as soon as the blank came free, it got very close to flying off the lathe. But luckily I was able to hold it in place with a gouge until the lathe stopped. Crisis over, I pinned the blank against the chuck with a tailstock, then sanded from 80 to 400 grit and added a wax finish. Then I turned the blank around and levelled the top. For this I used the full-size carbide in the skew. The rim would only cover about 25mm around the outer edge, so it didn't take too long to get it done. The next job was preparing the segmented rim. I was worried a lot of the resin would have been soaked into the walnut, but once it was removed from the pressure pot, I was pleased to see all the segments were still covered with no cracks or voids. I chiselled away the scraps of sapele I used to balance the weights on, then I passed it through the drum sander. It required multiple passes on both sides to expose the walnut segments. I only really needed to sand one side down to the walnut. The reason for doing both was because the top was very uneven and needed sanding, and the underside was shiny smooth from the silicone mould, and it wouldn't grip the sander feed belt, so I had to do it as well. And there you go, a perfect finish on both sides. So next it had to be fixed to the main blank. For this I used the usual rapid setting epoxy resin with some black mica powder. This was mixed in a silicone mixing cup and liberally applied to the resin blank. I also filled a small void, though I guessed I would have some additional repairs to do later on. Placing the heavier main blank onto the segmented rim, I measured around the edge to make sure it was central, then left it for around 30 minutes to fully cure. Half an hour has passed and it's time to start turning. The outside was first, adding the rim had knocked it off balance, so I started on that bit, first using the carbide in the bowl gouge to remove the resin covering the segments. After cutting away the underside of the rim to roughly shape it, I switched to the full-size carbide and set about exposing the main walnut blank. After the first pass, I had a look and I was pleased to see most of the voids were disappearing, but I had uncovered a couple of cracks. Anyway, there was no going back now. I kept going, cutting deeper into the resin. A few more passes and I was down to the walnut. Normally I would wait until a piece was nearer to its final shape, but I was keen to see if the cracks would repair, so I decided to do it now. Using the Starbond black superglue, I filled each one of the damaged areas, spraying it with accelerator to make it cure faster. The first round of repairs was a success, so I went back to shaping the outer surface. Having cut 30mm off the base before casting, I'd hoped to create a few design options. I started by cutting away the tear out, thinking a simple curved base would work well, but the more I went at it, the more the pedestal design seemed to make sense. Taking the bowl gouge, I began forming the cutout, alternating between the upper and lower cut lines, working my way deeper into the base. Now as you watch me shaping this bowl, it has to be said, I've done a lot of projects with pedestals, so in the future I'm going to deliberately move away from this design. I might do one every now and then, but it'll be a rarity. I recently did a poll on YouTube and 68% of you would like to see me do more varied projects, so that's what I'm going to do. I have a few things in mind, which I hope you'll find interesting, and there'll still be a lot of wood turning, but this time without pedestals. With the cutout roughly formed, I had to address the tear out. It was quite bad, so using a freshly sharpened negative rate scraper, I skimmed a few layers off the top, then after another superglue repair, I power sanded with 80 grit. And this did the trick. The tear out was more or less gone. I continued refining the shape, blending the rim into the lower section, then down into the cutout. Along the way I repaired a few more cracks and divots with super glue, allowing them to cure, then sanding them level with the surface. But I think you've seen enough of that. The curvy transition in the cutout wasn't working for me. Using a detail spindle gouge, I gently cut into the timber to form a much sharper angle, and being super sharp, it sliced away what was left of the tear out. A little bit of shear scraping and the outside was done. I sanded with 80 grit to remove the last few blemishes, and I moved on to hollowing out. Hollowing out was fairly straightforward. Using the mid-sized carbide, I began roughing out the rim, cutting down into the epoxy and waste block. The mid-sized carbide does a great job removing material, but on this project it was causing a lot of damage, tearing chunks out of the resin and the walnut underneath, so I switched back to the full-size carbide with a negative rate cutter. For the inside of the bowl, I decided to go for a flowing shape, rather than letting a set wall thickness decide how it would look, and I wanted it to be deep, so it would show off a lot of the wood grain. The sidewall needed a bit more work to blend it into the rim and remove the heavier tool marks. With that done, I moved on to cutting away the centre support. The bowl gouge took care of this, cutting from the top down into the base. And with the tailstock removed, I cut the last little bit away, then shear scraped the base into the side, used the skew to tidy up the rim, then switched to the small negative rate scraper to blend and fair the surface. I wanted the inside surface to be as good as I could make it before sanding, but going that extra bit uncovered some more voids, so just when I thought I'd finished, I had another repair to do. I mixed some rapid setting epoxy with black mica powder and filled the voids. Off camera I dug out the deeper cracks. These were filled with resin, which I rubbed in with my finger. I wanted to do this in one go, so I got plenty on. After 30 minutes I sanded with 80 grit to cut back and flatten the repairs, then continued sanding both inside and out up to 600 grit, then up to 3000 grit on the resin. Then I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Followed by 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch Brite pad. Next up, Yorkshire Grit, a single application, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing. First to go is Mirka Polarshine 10, a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polarshine 5, another single coat, polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, 2 coats of Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished. And this might be my last pedestal bowl. Only time will tell. This is actually the first time I've combined a cut blank cast in resin with a segmented rim, and I quite like it, and I hope you like it too. I deliberately chose the darker resin combination to go with a darker wood, and I think it's worked. The black resin joints in the walnut rim is a combination I'll definitely be using again. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.